this is another seminar on the Earth Talk series on urban science. And today we're pleased to have Professor Peter Grofman, who is a professor at the City University of New York, the Advanced Science Research Center, the Earth and Environmental Sciences program at the Graduate Center, at the Brooklyn College Department of Earth and Environmental Sciences. He is also a senior research fellow at the Carey Institute of Ecosystem Studies. His research focuses on climate effects on ecosystem bio-geo-chemical processes related to carbon and nitrogen cycles. Grofman was a convening lead author for the 2013 U.S. National Climate Assessment Chapter on Ecosystems, Biodiversity, and Ecosystem Services, a lead author for the second and third assessment reports of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, among many other things. So today, Peter will be talking to us about the bio-geo-socio-chemistry of urban watersheds.
I'm just very excited about this class, right? So to me, the idea of getting students at 3 universities together with focus on a particular topic is just really exciting. And I also like the mixture of in-person and remote. And I just think the whole thing is great fun. And so I'm very glad to be here with this. So I am going to talk, because you can see my title. I'm going to get my fancy pointer going. So my topic is the bio-geo-socio-chemistry of urban watersheds, which I will define what that is. And basically, I've been working in Baltimore since 1998 on something called the Baltimore Ecosystem Study. And I'm going to be presenting work that many, many scientists have been involved in, and I'll try to acknowledge them as they go along. So I'm going to try and cover 4 things. I'm going to give a little bit of an introduction to just what we mean by long-term ecological research and how that's been done in Baltimore since 98. And then I'm going to talk about research kind of at 3 scales. So I'm going to talk about a bunch of watershed scale research and focus on some nitrogen cycle research that's been involved at the watershed scale. I'm going to talk about work on urban grasslands or lawns at the ecosystem or the yard scale. And then I'm going to talk about some much larger scale work, continental scale work on what we call the American residential macro system. But let's start with a little bit of an introduction to long-term ecological research and what that is and how it was implemented in Baltimore. So the National Science Foundation has this long-term ecological research network, which is a centerpiece for ecosystem research in the United States. It's been operating since 1981. There are 28 sites that are, the vast majority of them are natural ecosystem sites, so forests and grasslands and prairies and deserts. There are a couple sites in Alaska. There are some coastal sites. There are sites in Antarctica, and these projects are. And there's two urban sites. There's always been 2 urban sites. First it was Baltimore and Phoenix. Now it's Phoenix and Minneapolis. And these sites, they're 6-year grants, and they come with the expectation of renewal. So as you can see in Baltimore, we were funded for 25 years. Many of the sites have been funded since 1981. And so they're very unique grants in that they allow you to address really long-term questions and assemble big teams to do that. So our effort in Baltimore was led by the Carey Institute, which is in New York, but the Forest Service had a huge role involved with it, the USGS, many universities, including Hopkins and the UMBC and University of Maryland. So lots of people involved in these LTER projects. And then many different components. So I'm going to talk about some of our watershed studies, and I'm going to talk about some of our detailed soil and vegetation work. But there's also lots of modeling and spatial analysis, lots of social science, lots of historical analysis, and then a program of education and outreach. Very similar to the BSEC project, which I suspect we've been talking about quite a bit in this class. But these LTR sites have been running since the 80s. Now, so Baltimore Ecosystem Study no longer a part of the LTER. The project continues because it was this nexus for interaction and multidisciplinary research in Baltimore. The project continued without LTR funding and with other sources of funding. So there's instead of the long-term research LTER, we have LTREB, which is long-term research in environmental biology that supports the long-term much of the long-term studies I'm going to talk about today. Claire Welty leads a critical zone observatory network cluster focused on Baltimore, comparing Baltimore with some other cities along the Piedmont coastal plain transition. The Forest Service has a really large program associated with their urban field station in Baltimore. And then the really exciting development is the Department of Energy Urban Integrated Field Laboratory, or BSEC. And then there's lots of other work that falls under the umbrella of BES, funded by different divisions or programs within the National Science Foundation or other foundations as well. So the Baltimore Ecosystem Study has been here for a while, and it continues as a long-term ecological research project, even though it doesn't have the LTR funding. Now, for those of you, I know that this is a graduate course, and I just have to spend a little bit talking about a bit of history and how we got to where we are in urban ecology. So the LTER program and the BES came very much out of ecology. So urban ecology has a lot of hydrology and soils and energy and atmospheric research. But the BES came out of the ecology, which was a discipline that really just very actively avoided working on human-dominated systems. The idea, like when I went to graduate school, the idea was we're ecologists, we need to study natural assemblages of plants and animals and soils so that we can understand how these systems work, how they've assembled and how they function. And people were reluctant to study urban areas or even agricultural systems. And a real leader in this was Stuart Pickett, who was the leader of the BES project for a long time. And he worked with a colleague, Mark McDonald, and then a graduate student, Rich Poyat, who's done a tremendous amount of work in Baltimore. And they started work on urban systems in New York City. And they kind of pioneered the idea that instead of treating humans as an external agent causing disturbance on the system, instead of avoiding human-dominated systems, that we should embrace humans as components of ecosystem and start to study these human-dominated ecosystems. And Pickett's a productive and articulate guy and worked on this for a long time and built this kind of groundswell where the National Science Foundation decided to add urban sites to this LTER network in the mid-90s. And it was in 98 when the LTER project started in Baltimore and Phoenix. And this was really a super exciting development for those of us interested in urban ecology. Very, very different from the much more natural ecosystems that dominate the LTER network. The real surprise, and this is something that I hope we'll get some time to talk about in more depth at some point, was Pickett was the intellectual leader of this group, and we all thought that we were going to, when the National Science Foundation said, okay, we're going to issue a request for proposals to add urban sites to the LTER network, we all assumed we were going to do work in New York City because we'd been working in New York City for a long time, and we knew New York City. We lived close by there, but instead, Pickett came back and he said, no, we're going to go and propose an LTER for Baltimore rather than New York City, because I think we can do better science there. And a lot of that was due to the research on social ecological research that had been established by Bill Birch, who was a professor at Yale, and Morgan Grove, who was a graduate student, still very active in Baltimore, working at Yale. And this is really quite interesting. There are advantages and disadvantages of working in a city other than where you live, and it's a long discussion, which maybe we'll have one day. But it's an important part of the history because people ask, what are these people from New York leading a research program in Baltimore? And I guess one other bit of history is, so when Pickett and Poyat and Mark McDonald started talking about urban ecology in the 80s and 90s, it was a novel and rare topic, say at the Ecological Society of America meeting. And if you go to the annual meeting of the Ecological Society of America now, urban ecology is a super fundamental topic in mainstream ecology. There'll be an urban ecology poster session and oral session every single day of the meeting. It's urban ecosystems 1, urban ecosystems 2. You'll end up with as many sessions on urban ecology and urban ecosystems as on any other topic at the Ecological Society of America meeting. And it's been very exciting to watch that, and the work here in Baltimore had a lot to do with that history. And if anybody has any questions or wants to argue with me about anything, you feel free to just interrupt me. I don't care. I'm used to being interrupted. Okay, so when we started in Baltimore, we started with some very fundamental questions. We started with a question about structure, a question about function, and a question about people. And the structure and function questions are very similar to questions in traditional research in ecology. So if I'm studying forests, the first thing I say is, well, what's there? What's the vegetation? What are the soils? What are the hydrologic patterns in that forest ecosystem? In a city, I can also ask the same questions about structure, but I have to add some anthropogenic components of that structure. So it's the vegetation, yes, it's the soils, the patterns of water, but there's the built infrastructure of many types, and there's the management of the different parts of the structure. And so structure, it works in urban systems like it does in natural systems. Function. And when I study a forest, I say, well, what's the flux of energy and carbon and nitrogen and nutrients and the fluxes of water? And I can do the same thing in cities, but I've got to add some human-dominated fluxes like capital and information in the system. So when we started, it was very much, let's do structure and function using the approaches that we've taken in study of natural ecosystems and apply those to cities. And the real thing that we added, of course, over time was people. The idea was, instead of treating people as an external disturbance agent of the system, can we study humans as an inherent component of the system, and start to ask, well, what do humans perceive and what do they value, and how do their perceptions and values influence their actions? And that was the real big advance when we first started. Again, these are old questions. These are questions from the mid-90s. And but they really got us started thinking about urban ecosystems or urban systems as ecological systems. Now, of course, the questions have evolved over time, right? So those were questions from the 90s. Here were some questions from about 2010, and the questions began to get more interactive and more focused on sustainability. So we were looking at the interaction between biophysical and social processes, and we were comparing the idea of an old-fashioned sanitary city versus a sustainable city. There was more of a focus on developing recommendations and policies to improve sustainability, and there was a lot more information on interaction with stakeholders. Now, these are much more evolved questions than the original questions, and they're similar, or they start to move towards the questions that we're addressing now in BSEC, which are very much on interactions between biophysical and social processes and adaptation to improve sustainability. So the questions started relatively simple, and they have continued to evolve over time. Okay, so that is my introduction to long-term ecological research in Baltimore. If there's anyone has a question or wants to add anything to that, this would be a time to do that. Or I will start to go on to talk about some of the watershed scale work that we've done. And I don't see anybody raising their hand or anything, so I'm going to keep on going. Okay, so the watershed approach is very fundamental in ecology. And watersheds are designed as an area of land that drains to a particular point. And the watershed approach is based on the idea that we can learn about ecosystems by measuring the quantity and quality of the water draining from a watershed. And here's a picture to help you think about that. So these are some forested watersheds in New Hampshire that have been subjected to different forestry treatments like clear cutting. And each of these watersheds is about 100 acres in size. And because there's these clear cutting treatments, you can see the watershed boundaries. So all the water, all the rain, all the precipitation that falls within this area drains to this point on a stream. It's very easy. You can see in this watershed, the watershed was cut and they left a riparian strip, and so you can see all this land drains to this point. And so the idea is, and here's another watershed. Here's a reference watershed that's never been cut. There's another reference watershed over here. But the idea behind the watershed approach is I can collect water, I can measure the quantity and the quality of the water draining from this watershed, and I can learn something about how that watershed is functioning. It's very much like urinalysis. You can go to a physician, and a physician will sample the chemistry of urine of a patient, and will then infer something about the health of that patient. And so, and it's very useful in a disturbance and response mode. So you can see in these watersheds have been disturbed by different forestry treatments. And you can then see, okay, how does that affect the quantity and the quality of the water that comes out of these watersheds? So you have a disturbance and response mode. And again, very analogous to urinalysis. If I have a bunch of students and there's a final exam and there's a paper and there's an oral presentation, there's graduation deadlines, that's a disturbance and that or a disease, and it'll show up in the chemistry of the urine. The thing that's great about the watershed approach is you apply the disturbance and you analyze the response, and you then use that as a platform for asking questions and testing hypotheses about the internal dynamics of the system. And so we can ask questions. We see changes in the quantity and quality of the water. We can then say, well, is that caused by changes in vegetation or soils or hydrology or microorganisms? And it's just a great platform for asking questions. It's also very useful for analyzing long-term response to subtle changes. So these watersheds here, this picture was taken in 1965 and 1985. Yes, 1985, or maybe 83. But these watersheds have been studied since the 60s and are still being actively monitored every week today. And the watershed approach is useful for evaluating these treatments, but then also analyzing long-term responses to changes in climate and changes in atmospheric chemistry. So we came to Baltimore. When we came to Baltimore in the late 90s, we wanted to apply the watershed approach in Baltimore. So here's a map of Baltimore County. Here's the Pennsylvania border, right? So Penn State is someplace up here and to the left. Here is the city of Baltimore over here. I guess there's a football stadium down there, not a lot of active after yesterday, but okay. But there's three really well-defined watersheds in Baltimore. So here's the Gwynns Falls, which was our main study watershed. And it starts out here in the suburban headwaters. It moves down through older suburbs and then moves down into the city. And that was the focus of the Baltimore ecosystem study. And you can see here's a land use map of the Gwynns Falls. You can see this, it's very dense, part of the downtown part of the city, with large parks in the city. And then you move out towards the older suburbs, which are pretty dense, and then into the kind of the suburban rural fringe in that watershed. And then we also took advantage of this watershed here, which is in Baltimore County and is dominated by Oregon Ridge Park. So you can see there's a lot of green in there. And so we have some ex-urban land use, and we have some completely forested watersheds, which provide reference for the urban and suburban watersheds that we study over here. So in the Gwynns Falls, we started sampling in 1998. We started sampling every week right at the headwaters of the Gwynns Falls at Glendon. We sampled about a quarter of the way down at Delight. So you can see there's that headwater watershed. We sample about halfway down at Villanova. And then we sample down at Carroll Park, which is just before the stream drains into Baltimore Harbor. We also sampled this ex-urban and forested watersheds here. We had an agricultural watershed on the campus of the McDonough School. And we have an urban watershed, Dead Run, which is a tributary to Gwynns Falls, but is a much denser suburban urban watershed than in the headwaters of the Gwynns Falls. So we set up these long-term study sites, and we started sampling in 1998, right? And so you can see here, we started sampling in the fall of 1998, and here's data going through 2018, and we've been sampling every week these sites since 1998. Now, a lot of our focus has been on nitrogen, and for those of you who are not familiar with nitrogen, nitrogen is important in its own right because it's a significant polluter of water and air. But it's a great, if we want to understand the interaction between biological, geological, chemical, and social factors, nitrogen is a great platform for those studies. It's of all the things humans have done to the planet, our alteration of the nitrogen cycle is much more so than carbon, much more so than water. We've really altered the nitrogen cycle because we need nitrogen to grow food, and we take nitrogen out of the air to grow food. We don't do that very efficiently. And so there's tremendous nitrogen pollution of both the water and the air. There's particular source of concern about nitrate, which is the most mobile form of nitrogen, and it causes eutrophication or overgrowth of algae, especially in coastal areas. So Chesapeake Bay nitrate is a critical concern to the integrity of Chesapeake Bay. Now, in watershed studies, we like to think about sources and sinks of nitrogen. So sources of nitrogen are things like fertilizer and sewage, and there's nitrogen in the rain coming out of the atmosphere. You know that disturbance mobilizes nitrogen. So sources are anything that increase the amount of reactive nitrogen in the environment. And sinks are anything that reduce the amount of reactive nitrogen in the environment. So plants will take up reactive nitrogen and stabilize it. There are a variety of soil processes which will take up reactive nitrate and stabilize it. So in our watershed studies, we look and see how the nitrogen is performing in these watersheds, and we then we test hypotheses about what the sources or sinks of that nitrogen might be. So let's look at some of the data. So I showed you this before, but so it started in 1998. We started in these forested waters. So here's a forested watershed. This is nitrate concentrations on the y-axis. And nitrate, again, is a great concern as a water pollutant. Now I've got a forested watershed, and the forested watershed has very low levels of nitrate in that stream. And this is not a surprise. People have studied forests all over the world, and they have very clean water and very low levels of nitrate. So this is not a surprise. You'll notice there's an interesting seasonal pattern, which at least one very nice PhD was done on that. Here's our agricultural stream. This is on the campus of the McDonough School. And this stream, this is also not a surprise. There are very high nitrate concentrations in the agricultural stream. People have studied agricultural streams in Maryland and Pennsylvania and all across the country, and they frequently have very high nitrogen levels. The real interest for us was this green line, which was the suburban headwaters of the Gwynns Falls. And this is the novel contribution because there's really very little. This is still there was, until we started, very little long-term watershed nitrate data for urban watersheds. And so you look at this and right away a whole bunch of questions come up. So clearly the suburban watershed is higher than the forest and lower than the ag system. So why is it higher than the forest and why is it lower than the ag? There's a question that we sent legions of graduate students out to answer. What accounts for the seasonal patterns in the urban watershed, which are very different than the seasonal patterns in the forested watersheds? And why is there this long-term decline in nitrate in this watershed and then maybe a tick up over here? Why is this going up over here? And this is the great thing about the watershed approach is you collect these data, you stare at the data, and then you ask questions and you pose hypotheses about what could be causing the differences in space and the differences in time. And I'll come back to that in a second. Just one other thing I wanted to point out on this slide is these data here show this is on the y-axis is percent nitrogen retention. So and I'll describe these nitrogen budgets in a minute, but we look at all the inputs or the sources and sinks of nitrogen in these watersheds, and we see how much nitrogen of the nitrogen that's added to the watershed is retained or held in the watershed. And nitrogen retention is a very valuable ecosystem service because it keeps the nitrogen out of the receiving waters, which in this case are the Chesapeake Bay. So on this top, this is nitrogen retention in the forested watershed, and it's right around 100%. And on the x-axis is precipitation. So over 20 years of data, I have lots of annual data. I have annual nitrogen retention versus annual precipitation, millimeters per year. And so in the forested watershed, the retention is very high, but it goes down. As precipitation goes up, it drives water and it drives nitrogen through these watersheds, and so retention goes down. And even though it's hard to see, this is a statistically significant decline in nitrogen retention as precipitation goes up, even in a forested watershed. Now here is my suburban watershed, and you can see two things. You can see one is the retention is lower than it is in the forested watershed, and that's an urbanization effect. And the retention is more sensitive to an increase in precipitation. So as precipitation goes up, nitrogen retention goes down in the suburban watershed, and it goes down quite a bit more dramatically than it does in the forested watershed. Here's my ag watershed, which has lower retention still. So now our retentions are getting down to 50, around 50% in the ag watershed. And again, the ag watershed retention is lower and the sensitivity to increase in precipitation is higher. And then here's a densely urban watershed here, a lot of impervious surface here. You can see the retention is lower, and again, even more sensitive to precipitation. So our long-term data shows that there's this really important interaction between land use and climate on watershed nitrogen retention or watershed nitrogen behavior. And so that's an interesting kind of constraint on all our attempts to manage watershed nitrate. And now those are classic bio-geochemical questions, differences in nitrate between land use and difference and the effects of climate on the relationship between land use and nitrate. That's a bio-geochemical question, but there's also a bio-geo-socio-chemical question in these data. So I've been showing people these data for a long time. I started showing people these data in like 2002, 2003, and people have always hated these data. People have always been uncomfortable with these results. And can anyone suggest what would make people unhappy with these long-term results that I'm showing here? Anyone in the audience there want to take a stab at what might be problematic with those results? Or let's see, who can I see over there? I can see. Anyone have any idea why these data might be problematic? Someone in the auditorium. There we go.
Actually, I had a question to Professor Groffman.
Sure, go ahead.
When we're talking about the sensitivity to precipitation, is that in reference to agricultural runoff?
No, it's just if you look on this graph, this is just annual precipitation here, and this is the percent nitrogen retention. So in the agricultural watershed, the retention is there's fertilizer is added, there's harvest removal, and there's stream water removal, and the retention just goes down as it rains more, just because it just flushes the water and nitrate through the system. And that goes on, and we see it in the urban watersheds, we see it in the ag watersheds, we see it in suburban watersheds, and we even see it in the forested watersheds as well. But why don't people like these data? And it's a bio-geo-socio-chemical, question.
Right. I was thinking about it from, I guess, from a socioeconomic system approach. Like, there are probably other factors that kind of influence what we're seeing on the graph. So it might not be as strong of a correlation that we're seeing from here. It could be other influences.
Yep.
So it's limited.
That's good. And that's uncertainty. And many people I mean, there's quite a bit of uncertainty. You look at there's a lot of variation and high ones and low ones, and that creates people upset. But there's more of a kind of a more fundamental, like to a general, when I show this to a general audience, they're unhappy in particular with this line over here. Any thoughts about what might make people unhappy about this? I see something in the chat. Let me see, maybe I got something in the chat. Just something about this. Okay, yes, people are concerned about this general increase in the 2000s. Why did this go up so much? And this is an interesting story. This was an ag watershed that we were very generously given access to sample at the McDonough School, and they keep horses at the school. And at this point, they increased the number of horses in the stable, which increased the amount of manure, which went onto the fields. And so there was more horses, there was more manure, and it showed up as nitrate levels in the stream. And when we showed this to the people at the school, they were appalled and horrified, and they took steps to reduce the number of horses, and the concentration started to come down. I think they've changed the land use altogether. But the thing that really got people upset about this is if you look at this and you think about, we're concerned about nitrogen enrichment of the environment and nitrogen delivery to Chesapeake Bay, and these results suggest, if you could just get rid of the farms and replace them with nice condominiums and suburban developments, then maybe you could improve the water quality in the Chesapeake Bay. And people are unhappy with that, right? So because we realize that, we like agriculture in the landscape. Agriculture is important for many, many reasons. And it shows to me the challenge and the excitement of bio-geo-socio-chemical questions, because, okay, yes, in a strict biochemical question, certainly replacing agriculture with suburbs reduces the nitrate levels in the streams. But what are the other reasons that we want agriculture in the landscape? And what are some other things we could do to manage these agricultural systems to improve the nitrate? And once you get into urban systems, you can't just do straight biogeochemistry, because people are involved and people's values are involved and people's perceptions are involved. And it kind of pushes us into a bio-geo-socio-chemistry, which is ultimately quite a bit more interesting and more fun to talk about. So I wanted to kind of highlight and spend a little time on this. Is the long-term data that we're continuing to collect. And it's just useful touchstone for asking questions why. And the questions are, they push us from just straight biogeochemistry, which is very interesting, but into bio-geo-socio-chemistry, which is, I think, a little more interesting. We also collect, as part of the long-term studies in Baltimore, we collect data, since we're very interested in people's perceptions and knowledge. What do they know? What do they value? How does that influence their actions? And so we've been doing a telephone survey or an internet survey going back to the late 90s. And just a couple of highlights for that. So we have been asking people in the Baltimore area a question of, do you live in a watershed? And this is a telephone survey or a computer survey that defines a watershed. A watershed is defined as an area of land that drains to a specific point. Do you live in a watershed? And more than half of the people who in the watershed, they say, no, I don't live in a watershed. It started at about 60%. It's gone down a little bit, but still more than half the people in the Baltimore metropolitan area do not think that they live in a watershed. It's a very disturbing result for us because, one, we had I like the idea that the watershed approach had been very useful as a tool in ecosystem ecology for integrating between soils and vegetation and hydrology. We also thought it was going to be a really useful tool for integrating with social science if people could relate to watersheds as units and then think about their place in that watershed. And that didn't work. And so we were surprised. And again, we've done this survey multiple times. We've done it in multiple cities, and we've had to deal with the hard fact that maybe the watershed approach or the watershed concept is very useful in biogeochemistry, might not be helping us so much in bio-geo-socio-chemistry. And that's the kind of thing that you learn with long-term data. Another thing we've been tracking is the willingness of people to pay tax increases to result in water quality. And people are willing, right? This is on a scale of 1 through 4. So they're not super excited about paying more taxes, but they're not against it. And this varies, as is shown in many of these types of surveys. People with more education oftentimes have more income. They are more willing to pay tax increases to get water quality improvement. This has gone up and down over time. But again, it's something that we think is important to track, is what do people know? What do they value? How's their knowledge and their values? How does that influence their actions? And so we've continued to collect these long-term social survey data in Baltimore. We've also collected more interesting spatial data on perceptions of environmental quality. This is just recently published, so here's the Baltimore metropolitan area, and we know these are all our survey respondents over a series of years. And so we asked them, are you concerned about air quality? Are you concerned about water quality? And then we looked at their responses in terms of where they were. So we asked people, do you think that the air is bad? And the percentage of people, or the probability that people thought there were air quality problems, it declined very markedly if there were a lot of trees around where they lived. So I can look at each of these dots. I can see, do these people see a lot of trees? And if you see a lot of trees, you have much less concerns about air quality. You have much less concerns about water quality as well. If you have a lot of trees. If you have a lot of bare land around you, then the people who have more bare cover have more concerns about air quality. So this is really interesting because it suggests that people's perceptions of environmental quality are affected by what's around them. Really interesting in Baltimore is we asked people about your perceptions of water quality problems. And again, the probability that people were concerned about water quality went down very nicely with trees as trees were up. But their concern about water quality went up as there was more water in their landscape. So if people could look out the window and see streams or ponds or lakes, their that increase their concerns about water quality. And it's kind of reflective of the fact that some of our streams and lakes on the Baltimore area don't look so great. But this is, again, the kind of data that's continuing, where we continue to do these social surveys, and we're going to be checking people's perceptions, their knowledge, their values, and these are important drivers of their actions. Okay, I am running out of time, so I'm going to skip some detailed work on nitrogen isotopes. I'll just summarize this real quick. I've got these data. One of the questions that people have in these data is, where did this nitrogen come from? Right, so here's an ag site, and I know that there's fertilizer and there's manure, and I know where the nitrogen comes from. But in a suburban watershed, I really want to know, is this coming from lawn fertilizer? Is it coming from leaky sewers? Is it coming from the atmosphere? And once I know where it's coming from, then I can get some guidelines as to how I might improve the performance here. Here, this was clear. We had a big increase due to manure. If we reduce the amount of manure, then the problem gets better. Here, there's really, we don't know where this nitrogen is coming from. Is it coming from lawns? Is it coming from leaky sewers? Is it coming from the atmosphere? And so we used nitrogen and oxygen isotope measurements to do these sources in the streams. And I'll give you this, you can, by analyzing the nitrogen and oxygen isotopes, you can tell if it's coming from the atmosphere, if it's coming from fertilizer, or if it's coming from wastewater. And you can look at these diagrams, so you can plot, this is O18 on the y-axis and N15 on the x-axis. And there's a couple of real tracers, right? Atmospheric deposition. If the nitrate's coming from atmospheric deposition, it fits in this box because you get a very elevated oxygen 18 content. And the other real good tracer is wastewater. So wastewater is characterized by very high concentrations of N15. And what you look at, here's my suburban watershed, right? That suburban watershed I showed you, and I really want to know, where's the nitrogen coming from in that suburban watershed? And the isotope data suggests it's coming from wastewater. And that's not the answer people wanted. People were hoping, well, maybe it was coming from lawn fertilizer, which would push it way over here. And lawn fertilizer can be managed, it can be banned, we can encourage people to use less fertilizer. So lawn fertilizer is one problem that's relatively easy to deal with. We were also people were hoping maybe it was coming from the atmosphere, because then it's someone else's problem. Atmosphere is a regional problem, and then the local people don't have to manage that. But these results suggested that the nitrogen in this stream, this nitrogen, was coming from leaky sewers. And in a certain way, these data are quite actionable and quite useful, because they say you've got nitrogen in the stream and it's coming from leaky sewers. But the implication is that you have to go fix the sewers, which is very, very expensive. Baltimore is in the midst of a consent decree to spend about $1 billion to fix the sewers. And but these data do suggest that will improve the problem. And some fancy chemistry. Okay. Go back to nitrogen retention for a minute, right? So I plotted back here. I showed you in this graph nitrogen retention, which is I add up all the sources of nitrogen into the watershed, whether it's fertilizer or the atmosphere or sewage, and then I see how much comes out. And you know, forested watersheds are up around 95% retention, which is very high, and not a surprise. But what was really interesting to us was this is a suburban watershed, and the nitrogen retention was much higher than we thought. Certainly, it's lower than the forest, and it certainly is more sensitive to climate disruption, but it's still, for the most of these years, it's around 80%, in between 70 and 90%. So there's a lot of nitrogen retention in these watersheds. And the question was, where was that retention going on? So here's a cartoon that talks about these nitrogen budgets. So in a forested watershed, the only input is deposition. And the output I'm measuring is stream flow. And you can see the stream flow outputs of nitrogen are very, very low compared to the inputs. So like 95% retention is going on in this forested watershed. And it's being taken up by the plants, or it's being stored in the soil or processed by microbes. The more interesting question is the suburban watershed, where I have the deposition from the atmosphere, and I've got lawn fertilizer, which is more than half of the input. I've got a lot more coming out in stream flow, right? About 10 times more than in the forest, but still the retention is really quite high, around 70 or 80%. And the question for us then is, where within this suburban box is this nitrogen retention going on. Again, in the forests, plants are taking it up, the soils are taking it up, the microbes are taking it up. But what about in the suburban watershed? And we spend a lot of time saying, is it going on in the soils? Is it going on in the plants? Is it going on in the streams? Is it going on in the groundwater? And these nitrogen budgets raised a lot of questions about where it was going on. Much of our attention turned to lawns. So as you cast your eye about the urban landscape and you think about where could nitrogen be retained, you start to turn your focus to what we started calling urban grasslands, which is just a term for lawns. And so I'll talk a little bit about the bio-geo-socio-chemistry of urban grasslands. So why did we start calling lawns urban grasslands? So we were trying to get ecologists to recognize that we can study lawns in the same way that we've studied forests and rangelands and prairies and other ecosystem types. These are ecosystems. They're dominated by turf-forming species created and maintained by humans for aesthetic purposes and recreational purposes, but they function as ecosystems. They've got plants, they've got soils, they've got hydrology, and that if we really wanted to understand these lawns, we were going to have to, or these urban grasslands, we were going to have to apply the same types of methods that we've applied to other studies. The other thing we were trying to get people to pay attention to was that there's a lot of grass. If you look out the window in any urban or suburban or ex-urban area, you see a lot of grass. And at the national level, it's a huge area is covered by lawns in the United States. The other thing that we discovered rapidly is they've got a really complex and interesting biogeochemistry because there's plants, there's really interesting plant and soil processes going on. And so if there's a lot of biogeochemistry, that means that there's a significant potential for managing that biogeochemistry to improve the nitrogen performance. And then we also realized very quickly that there's a complex and interesting bio-geo-socio-chemistry. What are people doing on their lawns turned out to be much more interesting and complex than we thought. So let me give you some highlights from our research on urban grasslands. And again, look out the window, right? So you look at it, and this is in any urban or suburban area, you just see there's a lot of grass. And we set up long-term study plots as part of BES to contrast forested areas, lawns, and riparian zones. We instrumented these with lysimeters to capture the water leaching through the soil. We've been measuring greenhouse gas fluxes. And we've been measuring soil moisture and temperature on these long-term study plots. And again, we've got 25 years of data on these plots now. We also had a series of other grants to do studies on real lawns, to go out to people. We got volunteers who allowed us to make measurements on their lawns. We've been studying the production of the grasses and the respiration in the soil. We've been studying carbon and nitrogen pools down to a meter. And microbial carbon and nitrogen cycling processes down to a meter. We've done N15 studies. We've done biodiversity surveys. We've done comparisons of Baltimore with 5 other cities across the US. And so we've done a lot of work on real lawns. And we've also done quite a bit of social science to try and get at what are people really doing on their lawns, and what are the factors that influence what people are doing on their lawns. So I'm going to summarize a lot of results here about the environmental performance of lawns. And the bottom line is it's not as bad as we thought. When we started, we thought that the lawns were just going to be huge sources of nitrogen pollution in the landscape, but they're just not, right? So one of the first things we discovered was that only 50% of the lawns are fertilized. So we've done multiple surveys, and I'll show you some of the results in a minute, but we kind of assumed everyone was fertilizing their lawns and fertilizing it at a high rate. But it actually turns out that only about half of them are fertilized. And even the ones that are fertilized, certainly they produce nitrogen-rich water, they produce greenhouse gases. They certainly, their environmental performance is worse than forests, but it's considerably better than agriculture. Agriculture is a lot more fertilizer, a lot more disturbance. And so we were surprised that the environmental performance of lawns was a little better than we expected. We also had ideas that the lawns were just going to be a monoculture and kind of a biological desert, but even the lawns itself. So we've done in some lawns that are very intensively managed with lots of herbicides, it's pretty close to a monoculture, but most lawns don't get herbicides, and they actually have a pretty good range of species, warm season grasses, cold season grasses, things that we consider to be weeds, but the biodiversity is higher than we expected. And if you think about not just the lawn, but think about the whole yard or the whole neighborhood, the species diversity is very, very high because you have the native species are present, but then you have all these species that humans have added. And so there were some real biodiversity surprises when we started studying this. A lot of the bio-geo-chemistry or the nitrogen retention is driven by the fact that there's an active carbon cycle in these urban grasslands. So productivity is high. Grass, as many of you know who have to mow grass, it grows a lot. So you get high production you get high primary production, which leads to high levels of organic matter in the soil, which fuels a very active carbon cycle, and that acts to tighten up the nitrogen cycle. The plants and the microbes are cycling and retaining nitrogen. And so the environmental performance of lawns is quite a bit better than we thought because there's an active carbon cycle and also an active water cycle. There's quite a bit of evapotranspiration as a sink for water. Some lawns have very high infiltration, others have very low infiltration, and it's kind of a hot topic. So for us, in 25 years of research on lawns, it has been just a lot of surprises about their performance is definitely better than we thought it was. Its environmental performance is better than we thought, and there's lots of surprises. We've done these more detailed studies, very recent studies, which I'll skip over because I don't have time for them. But there's concern that if you get out there when it's raining, you get these hot moments of export. But I'm running out of time, so I don't have time to do that. I just wanted to talk a little bit about some of the social science with these lawns, and then maybe I'll finish with that and take some questions. But we end up with this question about what are people really doing on their lawns? And again, we assumed that everybody was fertilizing. But as it turns out, and this was a survey from 500 interviews done in Baltimore in the summer of 2008, and you can see by far the largest group of lawns are people who don't fertilize at all. About half of the people don't fertilize. Of the people that do fertilize, most of the people do it themselves, and less than half of those people, or 20% of the yards, are fertilized by companies, professional lawn companies who apply at a pretty high rate. So the amount of fertilizer going into the landscape was actually quite a bit less than we thought, and the variation was huge. So if amongst these 500 people, of the people who did fertilize, the rate varied from 10 to around 700 kilograms of nitrogen per hectare per year. The mean was around 100. So this was interesting, right? Because we saw this variation, and we figured, well, okay, if we've got this variation, maybe we can figure out what controls that variation. So here we're plotting the amount of nitrogen that's applied versus the size of the lawn, the size of the lot, the size of the house, the age of the house, the value of the house, and the greenness of the lawn. And we had some hypotheses that house size or house value was going to be a big driver of nitrogen fertilizer. But you look at these results, and there was nothing there. Like, we were not having any luck looking for a strong predictor of who was applying a lot of fertilizer or who was not. And so this was a real bio-geo-socio-chemical challenge to figure out. I mean, I could characterize how much nitrogen was going on. That was okay. But what was controlling that was very difficult. And so our social scientists came up with a conceptual construct for this that they called the ecology of prestige, which is a term I'm not wild about, but it basically suggested that people's management decisions are influenced by where they live and by what is surrounding them, right? So they live in a community, and they're very much affected by the social norms or what else goes on in the neighborhood. So they live in a community, and they live in a given lifestyle group, and that very much affects their yard styles and their yard management. So, for example, I live in a neighborhood where the social norms are not to have super green lawns. There's a lot of dandelions, and people mow their yards, but there's certainly not a lot of fertilizer and herbicide use. And so I feel very comfortable not using fertilizer and not herbiciding. But if you live in a different kind of neighborhood, this ecology of prestige might drive everyone to be more intense, or the ecology of prestige might drive everyone to be less intense. And so this concept of, we can think about things like the size of the house and the age of the house and how wealthy people are, but really it's a more complex assessment of the neighborhood social norms or this lifestyle group that is probably the better predictor of people's lawns management. And so it's important to recognize that ecology or prestige can drive intense lawn management. So this is a real advertisement from a Sunday newspaper magazine section that's saying, get the lawn your neighbors expect. Neighbors talk, and whether you like it, they talk about your lawn. And this ad, I think, really kind of expresses the idea that you could be driven to use more intensive lawn management, which might have environmental degradation effects. But the ecology of prestige also plays out at the bottom end as well. So this was work from a master's student at the University of Vermont, done, I think, in the early 2000s. And it's really interesting to think about something like yard management and crime in Baltimore. Where in Baltimore we have a lot of abandoned houses, and these abandoned houses are just beacons of social decay. They're becoming an attractive nuisance for crime. And in contrast, if I'm in a low-income neighborhood or a medium-income neighborhood, a well-managed yard or a nicely managed garden is a beacon of stability, and it suggests that no, this is not an abandoned house, and no, you can't sell drugs over here. And so the ecology of prestige, it plays out one way at the top end, and it plays out in another, probably much more positive way down at the bottom end. And so, but again, the idea of thinking about our management decisions are affected by where we live and the community that we live in, I think is a big advance and helps us to think about our bio-geo-socio-chemistry in a better way. Okay, so I had some other things I was hoping to talk about. I was hoping to talk about some of our regional scale studies, but I'm about out of time. I wanted to leave some time for questions, and so I'm going to skip to the end and come to some conclusions. So the thing I wanted to leave you with is that we've been studying urban watersheds at multiple scales. We study yards and lawns. We study watersheds. We study this what we call this American residential macro system across the whole country. And the bio-geo-socio-chemistry is just super interesting. It's a hot topic. It's emerged and kind of exploded in interest within ecology, and it's just a really interesting topic. And it's also a relevant topic. But because there is this complex bio-geo-socio-chemistry, it means that we've got lots of potential for managing and improving the environmental performance of these systems. So if we can understand the soils, the vegetation, the hydrology, and the social dynamics in these urban areas, we have lots of potential for improving environmental outcomes and social outcomes. And the challenge remains, I think, is making that link from biogeochemistry to bio-geo-socio-chemistry. It's still the challenge we face. It's certainly to me, the most exciting aspect of BSEC, in that we're really pushing hard with new tools and new approaches to work across that boundary. We need to account for what do people know and what do they value, and how does their knowledge and their values and their perceptions, how does that influence what they do? And I think that's the real exciting challenge in this area of research. And I think it's going to keep us busy for quite a while. And so I will stop, and I've got a few minutes for questions if people have questions. I have one question here in the chat that asks, is it easy to fertilize your own yard by yourself? And indeed, it is. What most people do, this is certainly the majority of people who fertilize their yards, they go to the store and they buy a bag of fertilizer and apply it. And the fact that people go to the store and they buy a bag of fertilizer controls the variation, right? So we saw this terrible variation from 10 to 700 kilos of N per hectare per year. So I go to the store, I buy a bag of fertilizer, and I'm going to apply the whole bag. So if I've got a big yard and I spread that bag of fertilizer out over a large yard, I end up with a low fertilization rate. On the other hand, if I get that bag, same size bag, and I apply it to a really small yard, I end up with a very high fertilization rate. And so it is easy to fertilize your own yard by yourself, but you get a lot of variation in how it's done. And so there's another question here that the ecology or prestige idea suggests that fertilization patterns should be visible in space. And And this is a very good question because we have a current project, and I'm working with a student who just defended their dissertation a couple of weeks ago, which was addressing exactly that question. Fertilization has a very marked effect on lawn greenness, and it's very easy to remotely, well, it's not very easy, but it's possible to assess greenness in either like with handheld remote sensing devices, or with drones, or even satellite remote sensing. You can really detect fertilization patterns. And so this student did a study where we had survey data. We asked people, did they fertilize their yard, and how much did they fertilize their yard, and then how did that correlate with patterns of greenness that we were able to measure remotely? And it worked super well. So we now have a tool to we can really characterize variation in fertilization. And a lot of the work focuses on, there are certain places where you can apply fertilizer and you're going to have much more of an effect than in other places. And so that spatial pattern is going to help us quite a bit. So I have another question about, does the lawn concept include small gardens and plants or trees? And so yes, in the work that we do, especially the work that I didn't get to talk about, where we were comparing cities across the U.S., is we look at the whole yard. Now the lawn is in many cases the dominant cover in the yard, but in our studies we would go into a yard and we would identify every single plant in the yard. In the lawns we would do small quadrats and identify the different species of grass, but then we would identify each of the trees, each of the shrubs, and look at the gardens as well. And it's just super interesting to include the whole yard, because there's it revealed, and there's a paper that's just been accepted, which talks about the number of tree species in neighborhoods, right? So if you think about it, if you go out into the woods in Baltimore, there's probably 20, maybe 30 species of trees. If you go out into the neighborhoods in Baltimore, there's 120 or 130 different species of trees, because you've got all the native species that are you can find them, but then you have all these other species that people have planted. And so it raises really interesting questions about biodiversity, native species versus introduced species, and so yes, we include the gardens, the plants, and other than the yard. Do we have other questions?
Yeah. So I know when you were showing the graphics, you showed that the retention in urban areas is a lot lower than any other of the ones that you studied. And then now, would that be a better area of focus going forward for trying to reduce nitrogen? Or would it be more on decreasing the agricultural output that you showed that was much higher than anything else?
Yeah, so that's an excellent question. And so when you look at the nitrogen budgets and the retention, you have to think about controlling both the sources and the sinks. So the sources would be, and some of the sources and the sinks are easier to control than others. So the big source is fertilizer, and so there's very active efforts in Maryland and cities across the country to reduce the amount of fertilizer that either farmers use or that people use in their yards. And so there's lots of effort to reduce fertilizer use. There's also been tremendous success in reducing the amount of nitrogen in the atmosphere. So the Clean Air Act amendments of the 1990 changed the way fossil fuel combustion was regulated. And so now there's a lot less nitrogen in the air, and so there's a lot less nitrogen coming in from the atmosphere. And that's another great improvement. We also working very hard to improve septic systems and improve sewage systems, so to reduce the sources. So you definitely want to focus on reducing all the sources. And the other thing you want to do is increase the sinks. So there's lots of interest in stream restoration and in stormwater controls and in wetland restoration. And these are things that increase the amount of plants and soils and microbes that can absorb reactive nitrogen and reduce its delivery to receiving waters. And the Chesapeake Bay, I think, is probably the most exciting place in the world for managing nitrogen, because there's a very comprehensive program to say, well, what are the sources and how can we manage those? And what are the sinks and how can we increase those? what are our goals, and how are we improving? And the Chesapeake Bay program, it deals with agriculture, it deals with urban, and it deals with the atmosphere, and it deals with sewage. And no, the Chesapeake Bay is not pristine, but it's a lot better than it would be if we didn't have the Chesapeake Bay program. But the key is that it definitely focuses on you've got to include all the sources and all the sinks to determine what's the most efficient way to improve the performance. All right, now here's one of my favorite questions about soil compaction, pre-landscaping soil compaction and new developments affect nitrate concentrations in runoff. It's a huge driver of maybe not so much the nitrate concentrations, but the amount of runoff. So if we go into an area and we convert it, say, from agriculture to residential, or we convert it from forest to residential, the nature and extent of soil compaction during construction has a huge effect on the way water moves through the landscape. So in some cases, it's going to rain, and that water is just going to zip across the landscape, and you're going to get a big nitrogen pollution problem. In other cases, if you can have relatively intact soil profiles, then much more of the water soaks in, and there's much more opportunity for soil or plant or microbial processing of the nitrate. And so pre-landscaping soil compaction is definitely a big driver of performance. There's been excellent research in Baltimore on this. So Stu Schwartz is a professor at UMBC. He's made thousands of infiltration measurements across Baltimore. But most importantly, they've been working on, okay, how can we reverse the soil compaction? And so they've got the subsoiling. You do some subsoiling, you put some compost down there, and you can get fairly miraculous improvements in runoff. So it's a big driver. I think people are aware of it, and they're working hard to kind of improve it. Now, how long do I have, Antonio? Do I have till, or Ava, do I have till 7 or 8? How long do I have?
We have one more question here.
Okay.
Is it quick? Yeah.
Yeah, just a quick question. As you mentioned before, how the Chesapeake Bay has become a lot cleaner than what it was before. I've had a house on there that's been passed down through generations, and my mom says the same thing of how she can't believe she swam in that water when she was a kid. I was just wondering your opinions on how, I guess, on track we are to meeting our goals for like reducing nitrogen in the Chesapeake Bay and as well as other pollutants.
Yeah. So I've been coming to Baltimore for 25 years, and there was this idea that the harbor was going to be fishable and swimmable, I think, by 2020. I still have not brought my swimming trunks to jump into the harbor to go swimming. And I'm sure your mom would have the same perception that maybe there's been some improvements. I think, but the improvements are there's still a long way to go. But I think the important thing to point out is that the Chesapeake Bay would be much worse if we hadn't done all the things that we're doing now. And it highlights the fact that it's just really hard. So you would like the Chesapeake Bay to be pristine and the living resources to recover, but you've got a lot of people live in the watershed. You have a lot of agriculture. You have a lot of cities. We would like to control the water and the nitrogen and the phosphorus, but it's really hard. I do think that things are much better than they would be if the program hadn't been there. There's some evidence that we're kind of maybe approaching a tipping point where things are really going to get better and there'll be big improvements in living resources. So to me, this is an incredibly state-of-the-art question in environmental science. I do think the Chesapeake Bay program is a signature program that has done a lot of good. Again, and just one other thing I would also say about the Chesapeake Bay program is climate change is making it a lot more difficult, in particular the increases in precipitation and precipitation intensity. Right, so precipitation just drives all these pollutants from the land into the bay. And so what have we seen over the last 50 years is there's more rain, and more of the rain is coming in very intense events. And so it's kind of like they keep moving the target back, or making it harder to reach the targets because the climate is changing. And you look at like we have in our long-term record, we had some dry years. 2002 was a dry year. There was very little movement of pollutant into the bay. Bay looked great. You start to think, hey, we're great at this. We're really making progress. Then 2003, 2004, it rained a lot, flushed a lot of pollutants into the bay, and hypoxia got much worse. So this is, I think, and it really also shows the value of long-term data. We've got to continue to monitor and see what kind of responses we're getting to the things we do.
Thank you. So let's all thank our speaker.
Okay,
I don't know if you can hear the claps, but
I can see people clapping. It's good. And thank you very much for joining us. And I hope you enjoy the rest of the class.
yeah, thank you for joining us.
Okay. All right. Bye, everyone.